Transportation of goods, topic 11. We've got our purchase and sale, and we have figured out the financing. Now we're going to talk about how we get the goods from British Columbia to Australia using peak performance pontoon sail to G'day as an example. Trade terms generally describe two things. They describe where risk passes and who pays. So in other words, when the goods are loaded onto a ship, the risk passes to the buyer generally, and the buyer will then pay from that point on. So when risk passes, the buyer has to get insurance. There was all sorts of confusion in the marketplace with FOB destination, FOB point of shipment, businesses using the terms differently and confusing each other and resulting in either disagreements or disagreements that went on to court actions. The International Chamber of Commerce, although it is not a lawmaking body, went about listing off all the trade terms and explaining them and then saying to business people, hey, here they are, use them, and if both sides know the trade terms relate to the Incoterms, then there will be fewer disputes. Over time, these trade terms have taken on a sort of legal aura because of usage, just like Lex Mercatoria did. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through the trade terms very quickly so that you get a grip on them. And of course, because it's an open book exam, if there's a question regarding this, you'll be able to refer to this. FOB, one that we hear most often, free on board, means the buyer designates the vessel and the seller fulfills his obligations as a risk passes over the rail of the ship. And we've had some really funny court cases about that, where there was one where aircraft tenders, which are fire trucks used at airports, were being loaded in London, and as it was going over the rail of the ship, the chain broke. The tender landed on the rail of the ship, and when the judge was talking about it in court, he said you could almost see the people on the dock and on the boat waiting to see if the aircraft tender fell into the water, in which case the United Kingdom would pay, or whether it fell onto the deck of the ship, in which case the buyer, which was India, would pay. So that's how risk passes. Free on board, taken care of. Free alongside, used more and more now because containers are filled, delivered to the dock, and they may sit there for a long time. So the question is that container at the risk of the seller, or is that container at the risk of the buyer? And if you designate at the risk of the seller, the buyer, then you use the free alongside term. The buyer designates the vessel, as G'day did. They said the SS Leaky Sieve, and the seller fulfills the obligation when the container is at the dock, which is then considered to be within reach of the tackle. Okay, so that's free alongside. Then there's a couple of interesting ones. Cost, insurance, and freight. The seller must arrange for the shipping of the goods, the insurance, and risk passes to the buyer as it goes over the rail of the ship. And the seller is required at that point to deliver the documents. This would be a situation where G'day is making like a one-off purchase. And so they don't want to get a freight forwarder. They don't want to learn how to do this transaction. They don't want to have to arrange marine insurance. So they just put it all on the seller. They pay, but the seller arranges it all. That's with respect to ships. Okay, now we're looking at rules that apply to all modes of transport. So it applies to ships, it applies to rail, trucks, and aircraft. Ex Works is would be the best for peak performance pontoons, because what it means is, here's our plant, you want our skis, you arrange the truck to come to our plant, you pay to load it, you get the insurance, you pay for the transportation. Not used that often because generally it's very expensive for the buyer, and so they trade off in some respects. FOB, for example, would mean that peak performance pontoons would pay the transportation costs to get the container down to the dock. Okay, and then it's loaded, and a G'day would pay from that point on. free carrier is used for trucks and planes and rail. Seller delivers the goods cleared for export to a carrier. Okay, risk passes to the buyer when the goods pass on to the designated carrier, and the seller must deliver the documents to the buyer, and the buyer arranges insurance. Slightly different is carriage and insurance paid to. CIP means the seller must arrange for the shipping of the goods. The insurance risk passes to the buyer when the goods pass over the designated carrier, and the seller must deliver the documents to the buyer. Okay. That would be, we'll look at a diagram that shows who pays, because the first ones were getting the payment or the cost belongs to a certain party based on getting it on the mode of transportation. These are now going to talk about getting the costs being associated with getting it off the mode of transportation. DPU, delivery at place unloaded. The seller delivers the goods unloaded at the place of destination. Okay, so that means Sydney. The seller covers all the costs of transportations, export fees, carriage, unloading from the main carrier at the destination point, and the destination port charges, if there are any, and assumes all risk until they arrive at that point. So then the seller has to get the marine insurance. Delivery at place. Now, this is the seller delivers the goods at the place at the disposal of the buyer on the arriving means of transportation, ready for unloading at the named place of destination. The risk passes from the seller to the buyer from the point of destination mentioned in the contract of delivery. So that means pretty much their plant. And then the opposite side of X works is delivery duty paid. So X works, the seller or the buyer pays everything and arranges everything. Delivery duty paid, the seller arranges everything and pays it all. All right, now there's a document or a diagram on slide 142 which shows it better. Because X works, there's a plant on the left-hand side, that's the best. Then there's free carrier, and then there's the free alongside, and CIF and CRF, and then there's delivery, DES, DAF, and DEXQ means getting it to the place of unloading, and then DDU and DDP means getting it right to the seller's plant. So that helps understand it a little bit better. Okay, moving on. We're going to talk about the carriage of goods by sea, because most containers still go by sea. And a common carrier is defined as a ship that carries goods for all persons who choose to employ it so long as there is room. So in other words, if there's room on the ship to be considered a common carrier, which means you have certain exemptions from liability, which is a big advantage. You have to be willing to take anybody's goods unless there is a huge danger or unless they're just too big. One term you should know is conference carrier. It's an association of shipping lines. Okay, so these are companies that own ships. Instead of operating independently, they get together and form what could be considered a partnership. It just makes things a little more convenient. As far as ships around the world, one carrier gets a contract, but they don't have a ship near that area. They can get one of their partners' ships to pick that up. So it's an association of seagoing common carriers operating on established routes, and they have common freight rates. Okay. An independent line is a shipping company that is not part of a partnership, and so they operate separately, and they have a stated rate schedule over established routes. There is, however, something called a tramp vessel, and the advantage of a trans vessel is that they're far less expensive. The disadvantage is they don't have stated rate schedules, so you have to check on that, and they do not have established rates. I did some teaching in Vietnam, as I told you, at the Open University. When I was there, I also helped them develop the curriculum for their law school, which was going to start in that fall. They were going to have 16,000 students coming into their law school, and they had 5 textbooks and no money to just go to a publisher in the United States and buy books. Okay, and also there was a problem getting books from the United States to Vietnam because of the embargo after the Vietnam War. So anyway, I came back to Vancouver after my tour of duty, and I contacted the Law Society, the Law Library, and a lot of the larger law firms and said, hey, do you have any law books that are kicking around that you really don't use anymore? So, for example, we were using the textbook Smythe, Soberman, and Easton at that point. Well, in my office, I had the 8th edition, the 9th edition, the 10th edition, the 11th edition, the 12th edition, because I would get a new edition every time one came out. Well, I only needed the newest one, so I could take a couple of the less up-to-date ones and send them to Vietnam. So anyway, law firms and the law library just inundated me with books. I wound up with 33 boxes of textbooks that I wanted to send to Vietnam, to the Open University. The first problem I had was Capilano University said, whoa, we don't have money for that. So I argued with them, and finally they said, okay, you have a budget of $500. Well, I contacted air freight, I contacted conference lines, I contacted the mail company, and I looked at all sorts of ways of getting them there, and there's no way I could afford any of them. Eventually, I finally, in desperation, called a freight forwarder who said, well, why don't you use a tramp vessel? And I went, it sounds like the old movie African Queen with Humphrey Bogart. And I said, well, is there such a thing? And he said, oh yeah, they're independently owned ships, okay? And they just travel around and they pick up stuff here and they drop it off there, and while they're there they pick up some stuff and they drop it off here, and they just give you a quote as you go along. So I contacted them, or the freight forwarder did actually, and he found me a tramp vessel, and he said, okay, there's one coming to Vancouver and it can pick up your books. You don't know when it's going to get to Vietnam because as it's going to Vietnam, if there's some cargo that they can pick up at another place and drop it off at another place before it gets to Vietnam, it does. But it would get there, and eventually, all told, the cost was going to be $650. And Capilano College, as it then was, said, okay, sure, fine, we'll pay that. So anyway, I managed to get it done by tramp vessel because it was less expensive. Okay. When I'm talking about a container, you see these all the time. That's what I'm talking about. 2 terms you should know: full container load and less than a container load. A full container load, I should explain, they come in 10 by 8 by 20 and 10 by 8 by 40, okay? So G'day Mate in the quote said full container load. What that means is because these are a luxury good, and because they're potentially easily damaged, they want them in a container by themselves with nobody else's goods in there, and they want a straight bill of lading, so it goes right from Canada to Australia. Well, the full container load, and they're only buying a certain amount of skis, means there's going to be a lot of empty space in there. And so that means Peak Performance Pontoons is going to be required to pay for packing. So these companies have all sorts of packing materials that they put in there to stop things from shifting around while the seas are doing this. And you have to be extremely careful what packing you use. Obviously, some wood bracing would be good. But most countries don't allow wood packing anymore because of pine beetles and other insects get in the wood. And then you have to use plastic or metal bracing of some kind. So that's going to be an added expense for peak performance pontoons. The best way for us to do that shipment would have been less than a container load, which means our goods are put in there, somebody else's goods are put in there, and then the container is sealed. The danger of that, of course, is that that other material might be offloaded in Hawaii, or the ship may go down to Chile and then over to Australia, and the goods would be unloaded. Well, the only way they can unload their goods is to take the container off the ship, open it up, take out their goods, and then put in packing or somebody else's goods, close it up, and seal it again. Two problems with that. There's a danger of it being damaged when it's unloaded and then loaded again. And number two, when it's opened up, out comes this other person's goods, and out comes one set of pair of skis, and it disappears, and then it's repacked and away it goes. So there is, and this is called transshipping. Okay. So less than a container load was far less expensive, but there are some added risks associated with it. Transshipping is the transfer of goods from one ship to another before the goods reach their destination. So they're on one ship and it goes to Hawaii, and then that ship is going to Japan. Well, there's another ship that's going to Australia, so they take it off the one from Vancouver to Hawaii and they put it on the one from Hawaii to Australia, and then the ship that came from Vancouver goes on to Japan. Bills of lading are the documents that tracks goods, and a bill of lading has three purposes. Okay, it's issued by the carrier and it serves as a receipt saying, hey, yeah, we got it. Okay, it's evidence of the contract of carriage, how much it's going to cost, what the goods are, and it's a document of title. Okay, who owns it? All right. There are four types of bills of lading that we're going to talk about. And then we're going to talk about an airway bill, so there's five. Five. Potential Part B exam question. There's a clean bill of lading, which means if Peak Performance Pontoons is being paid by letter of credit, which it is, then we have to provide to the bank in Australia a bill of lading, a clean bill of lading. Okay, and that means that the bill of lading, or the instructions the bank have, is that 1,000 pairs of skis, or whatever the number was, are going to be loaded. Okay, if for some reason some are damaged and so only 997 are loaded, then that becomes what's called a claused bill of lading, or a flawed, or a foul bill of lading. It's even referred to sometimes as a dirty bill of lading. And then we have the problem that we're going to have to contact the buyer. We're going to have to change the directions on the letter of credit so that when our bill of lading gets to the bank in Australia, it says 997 skis, and the instructions that the bank has is it will be 997. The bill of lading, that's our purposes. Then the bill of lading is now used by G'day because it will track any damage to the shipment. Did it get caught in bad weather, and was it bashed about? Did it get offloaded and then loaded again somewhere, and some of the skis disappeared? Not Peak Performance Pontoons' problem. We've provided a clean bill of lading to the bank, and they have to pay out. Okay, at that point, all that other subsequent damage, which is noted on the bills of exchange, bills of lading, become the responsibility of G'day, and they have to arrange payment or compensation through their insurance. Okay, the difference between a straight bill of lading and an ordered bill of lading is G'day wants a straight bill of lading because these are very expensive materials, and so they want them to go to from Vancouver to Sydney and only to them. An ordered bill of lading is when you want goods sold en route. And a good example is Seville oranges, which strangely are grown in Seville, Spain, and they are loaded onto ships in Barcelona. Well, an English buyer bought a shipload of Seville oranges and was hoping that when the ship arrived in England, there would be no Seville oranges on board. What do you mean? Well, he wanted the ship to stop at Lisbon in Portugal, and then he wanted it to stop at Le Havre in France, and a couple of other places en route, and he wanted the oranges sold, okay? And then whatever's left over in England, he would sell there. But, well, how does he do that? With a straight bill of lading, those oranges would have to go right from Barcelona to London or Southampton or wherever it's unloaded. So you have to have some mechanism where they can be sold en route. Well, you have to have an agent who has a warranty of authority to act on your behalf to sell those goods en route. And that's called an order bill of lading. Okay, on slide 149, I show you a claused or fouled bill of lading, something that would cause that. And then we get into carriers' duties under a bill of lading, okay, because now it's like bailment, okay, you have bailed your goods, you are the bailor, the shipping company is the bailee. The shipping company must deliver the goods or dispose of the goods in accordance with your wishes. So while it's with them, of course, there's potential damage. And the carrier has certain duties. The first is to provide a seaworthy ship, and you can see that on slide 150, that was not a seaworthy ship because it broke in half. The holds have to be fit and safe, and I'm going to come back and talk about that after I get rid of the next one because of the picture. They have to be properly and carefully loaded, stowed, and cared for during the trip and then discharged after the trip is over. And you can see that these containers on the Itala, Florida, obviously were not properly loaded. Going back to the holds fit and safe, there was a very interesting case out of Vancouver. In the harbor, if you're going across the Lionsgate Bridge, you can generally look down and see big piles of yellow stuff, like pyramids of yellow. This is sulfur, which we get from Alberta, the Alberta-BC border. There's lots of places where you get sulfur, and they're shipped to other countries. Well, the sulfur, it goes up a conveyor belt and it falls into the hold of a ship. Initially, when they started doing this, dust particles, sulfur particles, went all over West Vancouver. West Vancouver is full of rich people. The rich people said, hey, we don't want that, okay? And so the Ports Canada had to do something about it. So they set up these huge sprinkler systems which put a fine water mist in the air. And as the sulfur is loaded and the dust goes like this, the water mist attached to the sulfur particles and it just drops to the ground. Problem solved. A few years later, we put chlorine in our water supply. Chlorine and sulfur, sulfuric acid. Okay, so without even knowing about it, a lot of this sulfur droplets were going into the holds of ships. And some of the ships that were coming into Vancouver and going out often began to have their holds literally eaten away by the sulfuric acid. And there was a big court case over that. So now I don't know what they do. They must use water that's been sitting for a while so that the chlorine dissipates. Okay, so the holds have to be fit and safe. The company was sued, and then they turned out and said, hey, wait, okay, you can sue us, but we're attaching the Vancouver Port Authority as a third party because they're, in fact, the ones that were negligent. The carrier has immunities, all right? So the carrier's duties, 3, okay? Seaworthy ship, ship properly manned and equipped and supplied, holds fit and safe, and the fourth one is properly and carefully loading, stowing, carrying, and discharging of goods. That's what they can do. Now, they do have exemptions. And the first one is fire, okay, unless caused by the carrier. There was an interesting case where this company had some very sensitive electronic devices that they were shipping, and they put them in these very, very unique plastic containers, and they were piled on the deck just like containers were. And there was a problem with the rail of the ship, and there was a workman there, and he was welding, and he's going shh, shh, shh. Every time he went like that, the flame from the welder was hitting one of these plastic containers, and it turns out the plastic was incredibly flammable. Up goes the ship. Well, had the fire occurred in the boiler room, or if the fire occurred in the galley, then it would be the ship's fault, and the ship would have to pay. But in this particular case, the fire was caused by the shipper, and so the carrier had an exemption from liability. Perils at sea. There's perils at sea on slide 153, and then on slide 155 there's acts of God. And perils at sea, and I thought, what's the difference between an act of God and perils at sea? Because perils at sea seem to me that if there were huge waves or something, that would be considered an act of God. And so I did a little bit of investigating, and I stuck in a slide 154, which talks about what perils of sea are. And there's a bit of a difference between common law jurisdictions and civil law jurisdictions. Common law jurisdictions look at each individual problem, disaster, fire, whatever, and they try to decide if that was a peril of the sea or whether that was the negligence of the shipper. The civil law jurisdictions, and we distinguish between perils at sea and acts of God. The civil law jurisdictions generally lump perils at sea and acts of God together. And the reason for that is, so we look at judge-made law, they look at codes. And so in a code situation, it seems more appropriate to them to lump them together. So in common law jurisdictions, perils of sea are the carrier defense that includes events peculiar to the sea or the ship at sea, such as accidental incursion of water, currents, storms, collisions, tides, and stranding. Okay. For civil law jurisdictions, they look at incursions of seawater, rough seas, storms, large waves, standing on shoals or coastal rocks. So pretty much the same, except that in Canada particularly, I'm just going to put in a period because I notice I missed one. There we go. In Canada and other countries as well, we say, okay, the perils at sea must be unforeseeable. Big difference, okay? So if there's incursion of water because of high waves, in a civil law jurisdiction, that would be a peril of the sea, and the exemption would cover it. In Canada, if there were waves that came over the ship and it managed to get into the hold and damage goods, the Canadian court would say, well, okay, was it foreseeable that waves coming over the ship might get into the hold? I mean, it's not foreseeable that waves might come over the ship. That happens all the time. But was it foreseeable that it would get into the hold and damage the goods? If so, and they didn't take any precautions, then obviously this is not perils at sea. This is negligence of the shipper. Acts of God are considered to be big disasters: floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, typhoons, and tsunamis. So, and these are, the perils at sea can be expected, anticipated. Precautions can be taken. Tsunamis and hurricanes, unexpected disasters. Okay, as a hurricane is forming, then you can take precautions. But a lot of times, your hurricane starts forming and you're heading for Florida from the Mediterranean. There's not a lot you can do. You get caught in it. Okay. So other exemptions: war and public enemies. So if your ship is taken over by the Somalians, you look to your insurance company because you're not going to be able to go to the shipper and say, hey, you should have gone somewhere else. Latent defects, inherent vice. This is an exemption. That's that plastic container that the electronic goods were in. This is an inherent vice. The seeds of destruction were in the material. Okay, so it's called a latent defect or an inherent vice. And so they have an exemption, and the shipper of the plastic electronic equipment had to pay for their damage and damage to the others. And surprisingly, the negligence of the shipper is an exemption. And then negligence of the master or pilot. Now here, pilot isn't the pilot of an aircraft. It's the pilot of the ship, and I should explain. If anyone has cruised before, you'll know this. As the cruise ship is approaching Vancouver, the captain of the vessel is at the helm. Arr, mateys! But as it starts getting into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, Georgia Strait, and then into Vancouver, the Burrard Inlet, the captain doesn't know those waters very well. And so a small vessel goes out to the cruise ship or any other ship, and a pilot, who is a captain, gets on board and then pilots the cruise ship into the dock. Familiar with all the the buoys and the shoals and the currents and tides and things. We were going into Barcelona, and Funchal, I think Funchal. It's a port on an island just off of Spain and Portugal, and out came the pilot boat, and the pilot jumps on board, and he pilots the ship into the harbor, and then he's getting off, and they jump from the cruise ship onto the deck of the pilot boat, and as he turns and the pilot boat starts going away, everybody was up on board or up on deck watching, and he turned and he took off his hat and he went, typical Spaniard, ta-da, I done it. It was kind of interesting, but that won't be on the exam though. Okay, the liability of the carrier for acts of negligence. So they are responsible for negligence, with the exception that they have an exemption for a certain amount. The limited amount of liability currently is 10,000 gold francs, which is approximately 10,000 US dollars. Well, no, that used to be. They have now modernized that from gold francs. They now use standard drawing rights. So there was a standard drawing right protocol in 1979 that got rid of the gold franc, which was just a gold currency standard, not necessarily doing anything to do with France. And they just have the special drawing rights, okay? You have to commence your action within 1 year or your statute barred. Some terminology. A voyage charter party is the entire ship for a whole voyage. Dead freight is a charge imposed on charters when the ship has less than a full load. So if you are chartering a freighter to take grain from Vancouver to France, you're chartering the whole ship, but if for some reason there's insufficient grain to fill it, then you have to pay the company a dead freight charge. Lay days are days a charter may lie, the ship may lie idle for loading goods. And you see that all the time. You see the ships out in the Vancouver harbor, and it's like there's 10 to 20 ships out there at any time, and they sit there for days. That's a huge cost to a ship. And so built into the contract is a certain amount of leeway where those ships are allowed to lay idle, and then anything over that, the shipper pays for it. Again, the cruise ships are still responsible for this as well. We were on a cruise ship in Vancouver years and years and years ago, getting ready to go on a cruise, and that was back in the days when everybody was up on deck and they would hand out champagne, and they'd hand out those little things, those curly little pieces of paper that you would throw off. Ship begins to back out, and you're all throwing those off and sipping champagne. Those days are gone because you can't put that colored paper into the water because of the dye and pollution, and they're too cheap to give you the champagne. But anyway, back in those days, it was a lot of fun, and we were up in the deck, and the ship's backing away from the port down Canada Place, and we're having lots of fun, and we go a ways out, and then the anchor goes down, and we sat there and we thought, like, let's go. What had happened was an airplane, a chartered airplane with 300 people that were supposed to be on the cruise, was delayed coming into Vancouver. Well, they could not sit at the dock and wait and leave late, because that would have cost them $10,000 back then. And so they pulled out, dropped anchor, and then when those people came, they sent in tenders and picked them up and brought them out. Tenders are those little boats, the rescue boats, or the lifeboats. What was really funny was they were bringing them all out, and then there was one lady who was in a wheelchair. Well, she can't go up the stair ladder onto the ship, and so they had to bring out the crane and come down and grab her and lift her and her wheelchair up. And she screamed and screamed and screamed and screamed. I mean, it must have been quite terrifying. But anyway, the whole cruise, that's what she talked about, because this was the most exciting thing that happened to her for a long time. Okay, that's lay days. Demurrage is a charge by the ship owner for idle days beyond the agreed upon lay days. So if you have 4 lay days and you're there for 6 days, then demurrage means the shipper has to pay for those 2 extra days. A time charter party is the entire ship for a period of time, no charge for dead freight or demurrage. Okay, so one's a whole voyage, one's just a period of time. So the voyage might be from Vancouver to Japan, but there's stops along the way, so you can have a time charter for a portion of that. I had the pleasure of drafting and working on a voyage charter party for one of my clients. I think I talked about him when I said that he had a partnership with a friend and to have a cruise ship franchise. Well, he was the one that chartered the Holland America ship for 5 days, and I got to work on the voyage charter, the contract for the voyage charter party, which was kind of cool. All right. Carriage of goods by air is becoming extremely more popular because of the size of these aircraft now. We had the Warsaw Convention in 1929, so the first flight was about 1909, so like 20 years later, bingo, we have a convention covering the world, which means, which limits the liability of aircraft for accidents. The Warsaw Convention of 1929 was updated with the Hague Protocol in 1955, and then the Montreal Additional Protocol number 2 in 1975, and the Montreal Convention of 1999. And what they're doing is they're updating the amounts of the limits given the inflation value of money. So liability limits currently, I believe, and it really doesn't matter because as long as you understand it, there are these limits. For personal injury and death, 16,600 special drawing rights. I get on the plane and I'm bumped up to first class because I couldn't afford to actually go first class. I'm bumped up to first class and I sit down and I go, "Hello, my name is Peter Holt." And the guy beside me says, "Hello, I'm Bill Gates." Well, whoa, Bill Gates. Wow, nice to meet you. If disaster struck, it was the only time in my life that I'll be equal in value to Bill Gates. Okay. No lawsuits. Okay, you commence your lawsuit and bingo, you're given 16,600 special drawing rates, which works out to about $25,000. Checked luggage in the compartments. So our ski team is going from Peak Performance Pontoon ski team is going from Vancouver to Australia to do some demonstrations. They take their skis and they would be in the luggage compartment, and we get 332 special drawing rights per kilogram. We know the weight of our skis, and I can't quite remember it, so I'm going to put it on hold just for 1 second. So I just grabbed the memo on the specs of our product, and our product is 5.44 kilograms. So you take 5.44 kilograms and you would times it by 332 special drawing rights. It means that our skis, one pair of our skis would be compensated to the amount of $1,806. No, it would mean that it would be compensated for the value according to the bill of lading. Okay, so our skis are about approximately $1,000. So our goods would be covered by that. Carry-on luggage. This is, I'm sitting beside Bill Gates. He has a laptop. I have a laptop. 17 drawing rights means my laptop. I get, what would that be? That would be like $25, $26 for my laptop. Bill Gates' laptop is a couple of $1,000, so he'd lose a lot more there than I would. Okay, an airway bill is a document provided by the carrier to the shipper that serves as a receipt of goods and an evidence of title, or evidence of the contract, but not a document of title. And I have been doing some research, and I can't find out why the difference is with respect to an airway bill, why it isn't a document of title. It doesn't say who owns it. It just says, it's a receipt that they've received the goods and evidence of the contract. But anyway, just a factor. All right, that concludes topic number 11, and topic number 12 is marine insurance, so we'll get into that a little later. Thank you.